He is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Millions of followers believe he is the Messiah.
Victory, of God.
I just remember as being big and powerful and charismatic and kicking and thumping his hands and waving his hands as he spoke. I just knew him as the Messiah. I was in awe.
They are told they are saving the world, but they're really just building Moon's financial empire.
Feed them cheaply, house them cheaply, get them out in a van, do the fundraising, maximize the profit over them, and just constantly keep the money flowing.
This is the story of Reverend Moon, told by ex-members of his Unification Church.
I was a terrible fundraiser, just absolutely terrible, because I'm shy, and I would start thinking things like, why do we need money? What is the money for?
They gave up everything for Reverend Moon. Was it a benevolent religion or malignant cult?
Let me tell you really clearly, it is a cult. It is dangerous. It is intoxicating. It is extremely difficult to leave.
It's a joyous day at RFK Stadium. Over 28,000 couples are about to be married at the same time. Presiding over the ceremony is the Korean minister, the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. These are arranged marriages for these couples. They are all members of the Unification Church, and the matches have been handpicked by Reverend Moon himself. The mass wedding is called a blessing, and this is the pinnacle for followers of the church, a cleansing of evil spirits.
And supposedly by getting this ceremony, you are magically rendered immune to these spirits bothering you. Oh, the blessing will cure everything. No matter what your problem is, once you go through the blessing, you go through the holy wine ceremony, and then you do the big wedding, bingo, all your problems are gone. Your psychological, emotional, spiritual troubles will evaporate.
Yolande Brenner celebrated a similar wedding at Olympic Stadium in Seoul, South Korea. She's a devoted follower, but she has complicated feelings about marrying a man who is essentially a stranger.
On some level, I was hopeful, and on another level, I just felt strange because I mean, we hadn't had any contact or conversation, really, or any type of intimacy whatsoever.
The unusual ceremony is just another area of members' lives that is totally controlled by Reverend Moon.
You would marry who he said to marry. You would live with your spouse if he said so. And so this was the kind of controlled existence that members of the Unification Church lived. Every area of their life was controlled by Reverend Moon and the leaders of the church.
Sun Myung Moon is born in North Korea in 1920. From a very early age, he claims to be clairvoyant and can see the future. At age 15, he hikes into the mountains on Easter Sunday morning to pray and says that he sees Jesus in a cloud. He claims Jesus tells him to take over his unfinished mission.
Reverend Moon's claim that he is the Messiah, that he is going to fulfill what Jesus failed to do, which is bring the world to peace and unify the world under one belief system, of course that being his and he being the leader. And that is why they call it the Unification Church.
Moon claims he later has spiritual encounters with Buddha, Mohammed, Confucius, and other religious prophets. In 1948, Reverend Moon tries to preach Christianity in North Korea, but he's arrested by the communist government. He's accused of spying for South Korea and put in a prison camp. In the camp, Moon is subjected to brainwashing techniques. methods he later incorporates into the indoctrination programs of the Unification Church.
Reverend Moon himself learned about what we call thought reform, or what many people would call brainwashing, by being in a North Korean POW camp. And when you look at the structure and the programming, the schedule within these indoctrinational camps that Reverend Moon created, you realize he's doing it. He's doing what the North Koreans did.
During the Korean War, Moon escapes to South Korea and establishes his Unification Church in 1954. His theology is a mix of Christianity, Confucianism, shamanism, and anti-communist rage. Moon is married, but it is said that he sleeps with young women followers to purify them. In 1960, he divorces his first wife and marries his cook's daughter, Hak Ja-han, who is 23 years younger than Moon. In 1957, his book, The Divine Principle, is published, and it becomes the guiding text of the church.
And The Divine Principle is his book, which basically is all about how he is the true father, true parent, and he is the Messiah that will save the world.
Moon states, the fall of man began in the Garden of Eden, when Eve tasted the forbidden fruit. He explains that all love relationships are imperfect, because Adam and Eve did not wait for God to bless their union. Instead, Eve had sex with Lucifer and then with Adam before she came of age. Being blessed in the Unification Church can erase the evils brought by this original sin.
So Reverend Moon and Hak Ja-han, his wife, are the new true parents, and they're going to have children, the true children, and bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. And so when couples were blessed, matched, and then blessed in marriage by Reverend Moon, their children would be blessed children, and they were born without original sin.
The church spreads throughout Asia, and by 1970, there are thousands of members known as Moonies. In 1971, Moon moves to the United States. He believes success in America will propel him to world power. He arrives at a time of political turmoil and American cities filled with vulnerable teenagers searching for meaning in their lives. Recruiters for the church target tourist areas and college campuses. The Moonies are extremely open and friendly. They invite young men and women to attend an intriguing seminar. In 1976, Gordon Neufeld, a young Canadian, decides to take a 2-week vacation in California, traveling on a shoestring budget.
So these two young men approached me and said, you know, there's a dinner, a free dinner at this house in Washington Heights in San Francisco. Why don't you come? It's a community, there's people of all sorts there. So I went to the dinner and they were talking about community, about people working together. It was all very idealistic.
They convince Gordon to stay for a workshop, then a weekend, then a longer workshop at their rural Boonville, California farm.
And I'd have to keep adjusting as time went on. Because after the first weekend, they said, well, why don't you stay the full week? They said, then you'll really understand, and it could be the opportunity of a lifetime you could miss out on if you don't do it.
Gordon stays. The schedule is exhausting. It's all part of the thought reform techniques.
It was a really intense group environment. People were very friendly, but you know, you had to follow a schedule. You'd go from the lecture to the group session and back to the lecture and then to playing a game called dodgeball where you throw balls at each other for a little while. Then you go back to the lecture and so on. And very little free time. And also you were supposed to always stick with the person who brought you, the person who's already a member, and not spend much time talking to other new guests.
Gordon falls victim to the mind control technique known as love bombing.
The real hook was that they kept praising me, making me feel I was an important part of the group and that I had something important to contribute. So I would feel that I'd be kind of rude or selfish if I quit. And I did have, at certain points along the way, a firm decision. I'm going to leave here. I got to get out. This isn't right. But each time they would just sort of wheedle me along until I finally said, yeah, all right, I'll stay a little longer. And then gradually I was in.
During the indoctrination, it's not initially revealed that the group is actually the Unification Church.
They had at one point over 300 front organizational names that weren't, many of which were not even religious.
They called themselves the Creative Community Project, but really they were part of Reverend Moon's Unification Church. But they didn't say a word about Reverend Moon for the first week, basically. You had to go through the full week-long session, and then if you seemed to be receptive enough, then they'd tell you about Reverend Moon. And I was not receptive enough until I'd gone through that week-long cycle 3 times. They don't necessarily convince you of the truth of their ideas, but they convince you that they might be true, so you better stick around just to be sure. So you keep putting off leaving.
The technique is to break you down and convince you that if you stay with it, you'll change the world.
You would go through the 3 steps of coercive persuasion, which is first, unfreeze the person, break them down. Second, change them, download your program. And then third, lock them in, refreeze them.
You were up at 5 in the morning and you were doing all kinds of things that would seem unimaginable to me only a month before, like praying intensely out loud, everybody talking at once, or standing in a circle going, glory to heaven and peace on earth, victory to true parents.
You're too tired to think critically. You're getting worn out. And whenever there's any doubt in your mind, it's being washed away by these other people that are like a constant cheering section for the Unification Church morning, noon, and night. In fact, you can never get away from them to think for yourself.
Yolande Brenner received similar indoctrination at a church center in London, England.
When I first joined the church, I felt this amazing sense of ecstasy and bliss, and that I had found the answer, and they told me that within 3 years the world was going to be changed and everybody was going to be kind to everybody, there wouldn't be wars anymore, there would be love that would last forever, families that would last forever. And I felt this amazing sense of hope, and I was 1000% in it.
In the church, the Unification Church, you were taught to just ignore your doubts, to believe that they were actually coming from satanic influences or evil influences, like spirits. Spirits were whispering to you doubts and fears and making you think that you should leave.
The main thing that was promised to me was that if I dedicated myself to God and working for the Unification Church for 3 years, that my brother who had become schizophrenic would become well. And this was always dangled like a carrot in front of me, that if I gave myself to God, my brother would get better.
What is dangerous about the Unification Church is the way in which people lose control of their lives. And they surrender their decision-making to the leadership of the church, which can exploit people and take advantage of them financially and otherwise to their detriment, and negatively impact their relationships with their family.
Unification Church recruiters claim they are changing the world for the better. But for some recruiters, that effort will come with a difficult price to pay. In the 1970s, Reverend Myung Moon brings his Unification Church to America, and thousands of followers give their entire lives over to his cause. The Moonies' dream is that their tireless efforts will make the world a better place. However, the reality is very different.
Reverend Moon built really a financial empire, and it was largely built by free labor. He had all of these people that were his followers that were at one time called Moonies. And so what they would do is they would go out fundraising, and there would be thousands of them fundraising every day all across the United States.
I just gave them whatever cash I had with me, and I cashed in my plane fare and I gave them that money. And after that, I was theirs to do as they wished. To start with, they would get you to go out on the street and witness, as they put it, to, in other words, bring in other people. So you'd go to the same tourist areas where I myself had been drawn in, and you'd try to get people to say, yes, I'll go to this dinner. And other paths that members would take would be they would start selling flowers and candy. I did do all that. I did do the selling of candy, costume jewelry, the whole works. So you're raising money for the church's operating expenses and ultimately for Reverend Myung Moon.
And a typical Moonie might raise $200 a day. Now you multiply that times 5,000 active fundraisers, and you can see how much cash that was. And there was a significant amount of cash flowing from Japan as well.
Mary Jo Downey joins the Moonies in 1979 as a teenager. A church member picks her up when she's hitchhiking to work in Philadelphia.
So I got in and he gave me a ride to my job, but on the way he started talking about the meaning of life. And I was, 19, and I was very interested in this. It's like, yeah, I don't want to be mundane. I don't want, there's meaning to life. We don't want to live this ordinary life.
Before long, she's in and ready to join the church workforce.
It started out with selling flowers at streetlights. So what you do is you have a bucket of flowers, roses, and you go out and you show people stopped at the light flowers. And some people would just roll down the window and stick out the money.
The Unification Church members during the 70s and the 80s lived oftentimes in apartments together. They would have houses that they would convert to churches, and they would live there. And the living standards could be pretty abysmal. I mean, a lot of people sleeping in the same room. It seemed to me that it was basically feed them cheaply, house them cheaply, get them out in a van, do the fundraising, maximize the profit over them. And if they get sick, get rid of them.
I would say that it was part of their ideology, really. If you don't keep yourself constantly busy, Satan can invade. So in the Unification Church, Satan invading means you get thoughts that are improper or that will pull you away from Father.
Yolande Brenner is sent to New York City to hit the streets, to recruit new members and sell trinkets.
We used to say it was for homeless children, or some people said for starving children. And that was one of the big struggles I had at the beginning, because I knew that I wasn't really going to homeless or starving children, but I justified it by saying that everybody in the world was homeless or starving because we didn't have a true home and we didn't have the nourishment of true love. So I found a way to work around it.
Reverend Moon uses the enormous inflow of cash and free labor to build a massive financial empire. By 1974, the church is raking in over $8 million a year. Eventually, Moon's personal net worth exceeds $600 million. The list of his business holdings is 71 pages long, including everything from media to manufacturing, automobiles to fishing vessels.
At one time, Reverend Moon controlled 1/3 of the American fishing fleet. And at one point, 50% of the wholesale sushi market in most major metropolitan areas like New York and Chicago.
Moon is a vocal supporter of Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal, and he organizes God Loves Richard Nixon rallies. In 1976, the U.S. Congress investigates Moon. They believe he is conspiring with Korean intelligence, the KCIA, to buy influence in Washington. In 1982, In an effort to connect himself to American conservative politicians, Moon founds the Washington Times. The newspaper's ideological focus allows him to befriend Republican ex-presidents Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, all of whom later attend and speak at church events.
He knew how to use those connections for photo opportunities, who would look at a photograph of Reverend Moon with the President of the United States or former president and say, this is a man who has real power. And he used that.
In the 1970s, church membership explodes. Moon holds gigantic rallies in American cities. He claims his rally in Washington, D.C. is attended by 300,000 followers. Often, as followers grow more enmeshed in Moon's operation, concerned family members try to talk sense into their loved ones. Moon squelches this kind of negativity and doubt.
In the Unification Church, people would be told, when you doubt, that's Satan attacking you. So when you start to have those doubts, or consider what maybe a family member is saying about dropping out of college and being a fundraiser for the Unification Church, instead of thinking, well, yeah, maybe I should really think about that, you're thinking, no, it's Satan.
For spring break in 1980, Mary Jo Downey decides to attend a weekend workshop at a country house instead of going home.
I'm awakened in the middle of the night and someone said, your mom's here to see you. So my mom had driven down from Vermont, and this was like the middle of the night. And she's outside, and I remember she was in her vehicle, and she was sort of like, it was like she was almost menacing the people there. Like she was driving back and forth and sort of revving her engine. And she was obviously really upset. And she said, are you gonna stay here or are you gonna come home with me? I didn't know what to say, and finally I said, I'm just gonna stay. And that's what I did. So I just felt so conflicted, but I felt like I did the right thing because she didn't understand. And I thought, I don't know if these people are right, but what if they are?
Reverend Moon's techniques are strategically designed to eliminate doubt. Is he now in total control of the Moonies' minds?
El que llegará a su vida, tocará su vida, salvará su vida. Pero en Nicaragua se tiene que hacer la historia del pueblo evangélico.
Followers of Sun Myung Moon generate millions of dollars for his Unification Church. They are willing to give up their lives and loved ones for their true parents, Reverend Moon and his wife. Any doubts are overcome by the powerful mind control techniques. When Mary Jo Downey hears Reverend Moon speak, she's surprisingly unimpressed and confused by his message.
And I kept thinking, I don't get it, but there's so many people around me who are getting it. I want to know, I want to get it too. I want to see if I can understand this. Because if it's true, I don't want to miss out on this.
Relationships are also challenging for many church members.
Reverend and Mrs. Moon will be officiating this wedding ceremony, and Reverend Moon has matched me to Robert Pokorny from Czech Republic, who is here.
You keep finding out things as you go along. So, well, what about men and women dating and all that? Well, it gradually became clear to me that they didn't do that. Men and women were kept in separate quarters, and you weren't even supposed to really talk about that, about attachments or desires or anything.
Being matched by Reverend Moon and then having my spouse next to me, that's wonderful. Yeah, I feel very happy.
Moon personally would choose your partner. Moon himself would point to someone in the crowd and say, you and you.
Supposedly, I had original sin and inherited sin, but blessed members had been purified. They didn't have any sin. They were just 100% pure.
You could marry someone, you'd be matched with someone by the church, and you might not even know them. You might actually meet them on your wedding day. And then people would pay fees to the Unification Church to be married by its leader, Reverend Moon. They might not consummate their marriage, and they would be shipped off to various locations of the Unification Church.
In 1992, Yolande is chosen to be blessed. On August 25th, 30,000 Mooney couples gather in Olympic Stadium in Seoul, South Korea. She first met her husband the day before on the flight from New York to Seoul. She becomes a born-again virgin by drinking a thimbleful of grape juice in the holy wine ceremony. Moon's speech lasts over 3 hours, and then he offers the vows. The couples respond, "Yeah," Korean for yes.
After that, we had the indemnity ceremony, which is where we were supposed to get rid of all our frustrations and resentment towards the opposite sex.
In 1976, Congress begins looking into a massive covert KCIA operation designed to sway U.S. policy towards South Korea. The investigation finds that the Moon organization is likely a political tool of the Korean spy agency and has systematically violated U.S. tax, immigration, banking, currency, and Foreign Agents Registration Act laws. In 1982, the U.S. government takes a hard look at Moon's finances. Moon is tried and sentenced to 18 months in prison for tax evasion, making false statements, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Moon insists that his actions are protected by freedom of religion. After losing appeals all the way to the Supreme Court, Moon is sent to Danbury Federal Prison in July 1984. He serves 13 months of an 18-month sentence in a federal prison and is fined $15,000. But even prison can't stop Reverend Moon's crusade to achieve world domination. Reverend Myung Moon claims to be the new Messiah, and his Unification Church attracts thousands of followers around the globe. But over time, Moon's true goals are called into question. In 1984, he is convicted of tax evasion and serves 13 months in prison.
His followers perceived this as persecution. It wasn't tax fraud. It was about, oh, he's being persecuted. He's being crucified. This is a terrible thing.
When he's released from prison, he continues to build his financial empire, thanks to the tireless efforts of the obedient church members. Moon returns to his lavish lifestyle. His opulent estate features a bowling alley, 6 pizza ovens, and a waterfall in the dining room. He publicly condemns gambling, but meanwhile takes his entourage to Las Vegas and has assistants place bets for him. In the mid-1990s, Moon begins investing heavily in South America, supporting anti-communist regimes and buying huge swaths of property. By the end of 1994, he pours over $150 million into Uruguay, building the country's first luxury hotel, and buying one of its leading banks, the second largest newspaper, and 2 of the largest printing plants. Then, Moon sets his sights on Brazil and purchases a 74,000-acre property in the Pantanal region, a vast area known for its extraordinary beauty. He plans to build his heaven on earth, called New Hope Ranch. Here, Moon would have absolute dominion. Moon claims the project will eventually be larger than England. New Hope will be the modern-day Garden of Eden.
Reverend Moon named it because he wants this place to be as pristine and as natural as it was the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were created by Heavenly Father.
According to the church, it will have an airport big enough for wide-body jets and millions of acres of fertile land. The church says that it plans to teach Brazilians new farming methods and unite the region's mostly Catholic population with the Unification Church. People on the farm hope that Moon, now in his 80s, will spend his last years in Brazil. From here, he can communicate with his 200 other projects around the world. But the authoritarian grip Moon holds over his flock leads many to question his motives in South America. And many claim his church is really just a cult.
A destructive cult has three core characteristics, which I would call the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. Number one, an absolute authoritarian leader who is the defining element and driving force of the group. Number two, that leader and that group uses coercive persuasion to gain undue influence over its members. And number three, that if the group is destructive, that they hurt people, that they do harm. They utilize undue influence to exploit people. It can be free labor, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, physical abuse, medical neglect, and then it can escalate to criminal behavior and violence.
Many members recognize the coercive techniques that lured them in. But Lisa Cohn takes a very different route into the Unification Church. It grows from a tumultuous childhood. Her relationship with the Moonies begins when Lisa is just 10 years old.
My parents were really young. They got pregnant with my brother, got married, got pregnant with me. They were in their early 20s. They were 20 when they had me. And so it was the 60s. They were hippie parents. It was the craziness that entails. They split up when I was about 3. We lived with my mom in East Orange, New Jersey. Encounter groups, primal screaming, macrobiotic diet, drugs, all that stuff going on.
of God.
Then Lisa's mother, Mimi, is invited to hear Reverend Moon speak.
And she came back and she's like, this is amazing. He's amazing. I always knew Jesus wasn't supposed to die. This is the truth. This is incredible.
Lisa's mom attends the seminars, and soon she's excited to take her kids to a church event. It's being held 100 miles upstate at Moon's idyllic theological seminary in Barrytown, New York.
And my mom, she had just been very lost. So when she's driving us up there, she's saying, this is the best thing ever. Here's the Messiah, here's the Messiah, here's the Messiah. I just remember as being big and powerful and charismatic and kicking and thumping his hands and waving his hands as he spoke, and it was just powerful and inspiring. I just remember thinking, wow. I just knew him as the Messiah. I was in awe.
Mimi makes the radical decision to leave home and stay at the church center. So Lisa and her brother Robbie go to live with their father in New York City.
He lived the pure hippie, bartender, sex, drugs lifestyle.
During the week, Lisa and Robbie live under their dad's hedonistic lifestyle. On weekends, they visit their mom in the strict church setting, and they even become playmates with Reverend Moon's kids. Throughout middle school and high school, Lisa completely buys into the church theology.
It was preached around us. If everybody who's an adult tells you it's true, then you know it's true. So yeah, from the day one, he was my Messiah, and I absolutely believed everything I was taught.
As Lisa reaches college, she begins to separate herself from the church, but it's a tortured transition.
So my mom got married on July 1st, 1982 in Madison Square Garden with 2,075 couples. Everybody I knew just about was getting married. I knew that I had been supposed to do that. I no longer wanted to do that. It was the most surreal, painful, weird, guilt-ridden, shame. At that point, I hated to see anybody in the church because I was so ashamed of the choice I'd made.
Lisa attends Cornell University. The campus famously has bridges over deep gorges. Lisa looks over the edge and considers the worst.
I still knew that Reverend Moon was the Messiah, and I didn't want to do it anymore. But the feeling of walking away from everybody I knew and loved, walking away from the truth, letting God down, how the shame with that, the guilt. And so standing on the bridge, it would have been easier to die than to make that choice, than to choose to leave.
Lisa doesn't attempt suicide, but she turns to cocaine, anorexia, and destructive relationships.
I look back now and I think I was punishing myself for failing, right? If I wasn't going to die by the bridge, there was a lot of other ways I could kill myself inside, and that's what I was doing, because that's how hard it is to leave.
Mary Jo Downey suffers her own painful experiences, enduring steadfast allegiance to the Unification Church. In 1997, she receives the blessing in a huge church wedding ceremony at RFK Stadium, but her eternal partner is not what she envisions.
Over time, he told me that in addition to being alcoholic, which never goes away, he was bipolar. He had been diagnosed as bipolar. He was hospitalized once for it, but he wouldn't accept treatment. He had been a heroin addict for years in the church. And he had an explosive anger problem. So he would just get out of control. He'd be so furious that he would do things that were dangerous. And I did not know what to do with that, because being just an average person, I did not know how to deal with mental health issues, with multiple issues like that. I had no idea. There was no way I could.
The church is aware of the problems, but they simply advise Mary Jo to work harder on their relationship.
The church leader's wife was telling me, when he comes home from work, take his hand and tell him what a good job he does.
The couple has a daughter together, but the relationship never improves.
One time, my ex-husband attacked me when I was going down a hallway, and he put a strap around my neck and pushed me up against a wall. And I actually went to the police, but I couldn't press charges. I could not do it. And the officer looked so sad, come back. He said, I will do it. And I couldn't.
The Unification Church has Mary Jo Downey and her young daughter trapped in an abusive, violent relationship. But what she does next surprises even herself. The Unification Church of Myung Moon sets up thousands of people in massive wedding ceremonies. They put together complete strangers who often find something very different from their expectations of a happy and sinless life. Mary Jo Downey is locked in such a marriage. Despite the promises of the church, the violent, abusive relationship continues, hurling down a dangerous path.
I considered an intervention that my husband would straighten out, and then we'd reconcile. And then over time, I started going to a domestic violence counselor, and I started reading things, and I said, I don't want to be reconciled. I don't want to do this. I've reached the point that I can't do it anymore.
Mary Jo eventually escapes the relationship, and there are no apologies from the Unification Church. Reverend Moon, as the Messiah, can never be wrong.
And I would see him, in my opinion, as a very narcissistic, self-obsessed individual that was all about himself, his ego, his fulfillment. And many cult leaders have been described that way, as megalomaniacs, as deeply narcissistic people, even malignantly narcissistic.
Eventually, Gordon Neufeld comes to this realization about Reverend Moon and feels his own life is going nowhere.
I wish I could get those years back. I wish I could have. There were several opportunities along the way where I could have quit. Why didn't I do it then? So you wish you could go back and change those things.
But quitting an organization like this is extremely difficult.
But I did ask myself, well, what would it take for me to finally say enough? And I felt like, well, the only way I could get to that point where I'd say it's enough is if I felt like that my alternative is suicide.
Fortunately, Gordon is able to make the break after 10 years as a Moonie.
I guess that is one of the things you regret after leaving a group is you realize, oh, I thought I was changing the world, and I was actually making it worse. I thought I was helping, but I was not.
Lisa Cohn has been out of the church for decades, but it still influences her life.
I did not join of my own free will, right? It was given to me. And so when you're born and or raised in it, it pickles your brain and carves you in such unique ways. And it becomes very hard to separate yourself and to figure it out because it's so, you don't know what's you and you don't know what's the cult. I wasn't physically abused that I remember in the church. There weren't awful things that happened, but it obviously scarred me. But let me tell you really clearly, it is a cult. It is dangerous. It is intoxicating. It is extremely difficult to leave.
Yolande Brenner's blessed marriage also fails. But worse yet for her is the promised cure for her brother's mental illness that never materializes. And the church leaders blame her.
One of my central figures told me that it was my fault, that my brother was mentally ill, and that it was because of the evil spirits around me. And I felt really bad because I felt like the whole purpose for me giving up my life was false, and he wasn't going to get better. And that was the thing that made me feel even worse, was that when my brother first started to become mentally ill, he came to me and told me that I was the only person that could make him better, and that being with me was the only thing that would make him better. I still feel like it was a terrible failure.
In 2012, son Myung Moon dies at the age of 92, and his wife and children take over. His family has been plagued with scandal for years: drug abuse, infidelity, illegitimate children, and financial excess. But nevertheless, the Unification Church continues.
It's very much around. It's different. It's being run by another generation, but it's very much an authoritarian organization that is very rich and still quite powerful.
You're not yourself, but you're in a different milieu where you're thinking differently, and you think, it's almost like possibility thinking, and you think, yes, this sounds really good. It's almost like going to Vegas. Like you're a different person when you go to Vegas. It's almost like you step into a whole different world.
I realized that I just wasn't even wanted. That I just decided, okay, this isn't the answer. These aren't perfect families. These aren't perfect leaders. This isn't really a true family. And I've been believing this, and I gave up everything to do this for 15 years, and actually it was all a lie.
Often, when people look at destructive cults, they say it can only impact people who are susceptible. But the lure may be more powerful than that.
When I left the Unification Church, the only qualification I could readily put into the job marketplace was I knew how to type. So I learned to be a word processing operator, and I got working as a legal assistant and so on. I feel like I could have done a lot more than that if I hadn't been sidetracked for so long. And then there's anger that they would manipulate people and make them throw away their dreams. And then you feel bad about the people who are still there.
In a cult or an extreme situation, you have absolute certainty. It is the most intoxicating drug ever. You have purpose, you know exactly what you're here, what you need to do, what God needs you to do, and you have a community like you'll never find anywhere else. So it fulfills all your needs as a human, so who wouldn't want that? Even when it's wrong, right? But who wouldn't want it? Yeah.
He calls himself a holy man, yet he takes brides as young as age 12. He stockpiles assault weapons and millions of rounds of ammunition.
What's a gun? Yes, we have guns.
So why did they have all the guns and bullets? They were preparing for the apocalypse.
And he rationalized that all of these weapons that they were stockpiling were not because he was paranoid, but rather because Satan was going to come for them.
He separates husbands from their wives to sleep with the women, and sometimes even their underage daughters.
One of his major ideas that he develops is that all of the women who are in the compound, they belong to him.
Yet he commits these acts in the name of Jesus Christ. But maybe the most shocking thing is that nearly 30 years after these unspeakable deeds, David Koresh still has followers.
Whatever he did was according to what God had told him to do.
Flames, as you can see, just pouring out. And I think those of us who have watched this certainly did not expect this.
He is the so-called Sinful Messiah who led his followers to an apocalypse in Texas. Roughly halfway between Dallas and Austin, you'll find the town of Waco, home to the Texas Rangers Museum and the Dr. Pepper Museum. It's also about 25 miles away from President George W. Bush's Crawford Ranch. Comedian Steve Martin and actress Jennifer Love Hewitt were born here. It doesn't seem the kind of place where the world comes to an end. But from February to April 1993, that's exactly what it looked like.
When the FBI arrived in Waco, we found what looked like the remnants of a war. We had 4 dead ATF agents. We believe we had 5 dead Branch Davidians.
Why did Waco happen? That is David Koresh. His real name was Vernon Howe. They were a cult leader. They were a cult. David Koresh was the cult leader.
We do not want anyone to be hurt. Follow all instructions. This is not an assault. Do not fire any weapons. We do not want anyone to be injured. Gas will continue to be delivered until everyone is out of the building. Exit the compound now.
When the FBI was given the authority initially to do the negotiations, the first thing that we were trying to do is figure out who the heck these people were.
They were the Branch Davidians. They were a breakaway group of the Seventh-day Adventists who formed in the middle of the 20th century. Back during the Cold War, a lot of people believed the end of the world is coming. But no one believes in Armageddon more than the Davidians, then under the leadership of one Florence Houtef.
And she came up with a new interpretation of the Bible and actually predicted that the world was going to end in April of 1959. In fact, all the Davidians from around the world came to Waco. It was covered nationally. I think it was in Time or Life magazine. Featured that, but when the end of the world did not happen, a lot of the Branch Davidians fell away.
The Branch Davidians refer to the failure of the world to end in 1959 as the Great Disappointment, but not everyone leaves the sect. In their compound a few miles outside Waco, they are ripe for a charismatic leader to preach a new Armageddon, and in the 1980s they get one. Soon, the disciples come from far and wide. They come from across the U.S., from Israel, and from as far as Australia.
David can explain this Bible better than anyone that I've ever met.
You're going to see whether you believe this message. I'm ready to be delivered. I'm ready to go to the portals of darkness and death, and you're not. Let's see if you believe the message after so many years.
We still believe that there's going to be a kingdom over in Israel, and that David Koresh is going to come back and be the head of that kingdom, and that it's going to be a peaceful place. We're not, all upset because we know this is going to come.
The man that creates his own apocalyptic sect on the fringes of Waco becomes known to the world as David Koresh, but he is born Vernon Wayne Howell on August 17, 1959, in Houston. At his birth, his mother is just 14 years old, and his father had abandoned her while she was still pregnant.
His mother, Bonnie Sue Clark, has a lot of personal psychological challenges and difficulties. She even drops him off at his grandmother's, and he is raised for a couple years by his grandmother. She then takes him back. He grows up in really kind of a challenging home, not knowing his dad.
The young boy has a lot to contend with, a combination of dyslexia and what would today probably be diagnosed as ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder.
One story that I recall, when he was in I believe it was the second or third grade, he was in a group that was in a special needs class. And he said as they were running out to the playground, the other kids there called out, said, "Here come the retards. Here come the retards."
There are any number of people that grow up in difficult homes and rise above their circumstances. But young David Koresh carries that burden of pain with him wherever he goes, and he will find many ways to inflict that pain on others, all in the name of religion.
He had a lot of insecurities about himself, but overcame those with an ability to memorize scripture. Now, how does that work with being dyslexic? I'm not sure, but he had that special gift. And supposedly by the time he was 12 years old, he had memorized the entire New Testament of the Bible.
He thought he was of the house of David, like King David, and that there was the word Koresh, I think, in the book of Daniel. And he created this name that would be a fulfillment of prophecy, that he would be a Messiah that would save the world.
I knew it had to be a gift from God. And all a prophet means is a mouthpiece of God. It's nothing, it's just a man, But I felt like God was leading him, I really did. It amazed me, it was awesome.
A brooding young preacher with rock star good looks and a devoted cult-like following, that is the self-styled David Koresh. As a boy, few could have predicted what momentous and terrible things lie in store for Koresh, and anyone else who gets too close to his deadly flame. By his early 20s, Vernon Wayne Howell, aka David Koresh, has tried many lifestyles. He was fascinated with religion and preachers since childhood. He could quote passages from the Bible at will, but he also spends time in LA trying to make it as a rock musician.
He wants to be a rock star. He's actually a pretty good guitarist and can sing. Even goes to Los Angeles and Hollywood and tries to pursue the life of a rock star, but none of that works out well.
There's a touch of Jim Morrison in his look, and even today, you can still find some of David Koresh's songs online, such as the Book of Daniel and the prophetic Madman in Waco. By the early 80s, the would-be rock star is back in Texas, still searching. He's been interested in Seventh-day Adventism for a while. When he hears about the Branch Davidians, the group's headquarters is just outside of Waco.
This idea of a living prophet is very attractive to him. So he gets in his car and he drives to Waco, and he meets a woman named Lois Roden, who is part of the Branch Davidian, and she kind of takes him as his protege.
At that time, Lois Roden is a woman in her 60s.
Gradually, he gained influence over this long-established group that had a peaceful history because of his relationship with Lois Roden, who was arguably a rather benign figure, a kindly woman who never made trouble for the town of Waco.
She encourages him. They develop a relationship, and he has what some people call the new light. That is, because he sees himself as kind of a messianic figure, a prophetic type figure.
And remember that originally, even the original group of Davidians, they went out there because they were told and convinced that this was the end of times. So it's the end times. So they sold everything they had, gave all their money to some of the original founders.
A revelation which God gave to him. We don't need the revelation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We already have that. We don't need the revelation of Jerry Falwell, or Pat Robertson, or Oral Roberts. We don't need the revelation of men.
David Koresh will tap into that generosity just as soon as he can take over as the leader of the Branch Davidians. In the meantime, he decides to get married. This will be his first and only official marriage.
So probably the only legitimate marriage he has is to his wife Rachel. She is young. She has to get the approval of her parents for Vernon Howell, David Koresh, to marry her.
On their wedding day, Rachel is just 14 years old. Her husband is 25 years old and claims to be not only a religious man, but the preacher of a new gospel. Then, Lois Roden, leader of the Branch Davidians, passes away. The newlywed lay preacher wants to take over as the Davidians' new leader, but it's not going to be that simple.
So David Koresh had to split with another person who wanted to be the leader as well.
That other person vying for leadership is Lois Roden's son, George, claiming to be the rightful heir. And to have the support of most of the Davidians, George Roden chases David Koresh off the Mount Carmel ranch at gunpoint.
George is jealous of Vernon Howell because people there like him. They like his take, they like his enthusiasm. It goes bad very, very quickly. There's a gun battle. Vernon Howell is forced out. He goes to Palestine, Texas with about 25 of his followers, and they live there in tents and buses.
Now in exile, Koresh and a few dozen of his supporters pitch camp outside Palestine, at the western terminus of the Texas State Railroad. For the next 2 years, they live hand to mouth with no running water. But the conditions don't deter followers. Instead, new recruits arrive from far and wide. One of them is Australian Graham Craddock. The young Australian has no idea what is in store for him when he joins the Branch Davidians. Now, 30 years later, Graham Craddock walks for miles every day, trying to forget what he experienced as a follower of David Koresh.
Sometimes I do feel guilty that I'm still alive. In some respects, I'm glad I'm alive, because if I wasn't here doing this, nobody would be able to do what I can tell you.
When Craddock joins the Branch Davidians in 1988, he is drawn to the apocalyptic visions that Koresh preaches. His mastery of the Bible includes an impressive ability to harmonize, which means to combine scripture from the Old and New Testaments.
I mean, sure we know about Noah's Ark. Sure we know about Israel perishing in the wilderness. Sure we know that the same Christ who offers a healing arm of health is the same Christ who smites the wicked.
The Branch Davidians are already convinced the end of the world is near, and David Koresh adds to that a sense of urgency. He will portray the federal government as the enemy, and to top it off, he exudes an element of sex appeal.
David Koresh fit the typical personality profile of a destructive cult leader. He has been described as a psychopath by mental health professionals. And he was deeply narcissistic, but very charismatic, very good speaker, could quote the Bible back and forth, very, very good at that. And he was appealing to women. And in fact, it was his appeal, arguably, that made him the head of the Waco Davidian sect.
David Koresh has endured, or so it seems. He has left his difficult childhood behind. After a stab at becoming a musician, he seems to find his calling with the Branch Davidians. Part holy man, part sinner, Koresh is driven to control his followers, even if it means leading them to their death. He's a troubled young man with a difficult childhood, drawn to the Bible, especially the book of Revelations. David Koresh comes to be worshipped by the Branch Davidians as the Sinful Messiah.
He was a sinful person, as we all are. I think he did not, the way I understand it, you know, Jesus came perfect and everything, but he had a message to give, and he could give it better, I think, because he had experienced so many things, the sins of the world and all this kind of stuff.
There's even a story that he was sexually molested about age 5. And so he has kind of a difficult time, becomes interested in religion. His mother takes him to a local Seventh-day Adventist church. He becomes very interested in radio preachers, listening to them on the radio.
By the time David Koresh becomes a leader of the Branch Davidians, his philosophy has crystallized. It's one that allows him to do whatever he desires, while demanding absolute loyalty from his followers.
He would say, well, I am not like Jesus. I'm a different kind of Messiah. I am speaking for God. And if you go against me, you go against God. And he would say only he understood the book of Revelation, and that he had the keys, he had the prophecy, he had the vision, and that if you weren't with him, you would be destroyed in doomsday, in the final judgment.
By 1987, 27-year-old David Koresh is at a crossroads. The only way for him to build on his small but devoted following is to take over the Branch Davidians compound in Waco, Texas. To do that, he will have to get rid of its self-appointed leader, George Roden.
He'd been in a little bit of trouble before because during this struggle over who was going to lead the Branch Davidians, he actually was in a major gunfight with the other Davidian leader.
David Koresh was tried for attempted murder. He was acquitted by a hung jury, and then he went back to take over the compound.
In 1989, George Roden makes it easier for David Koresh when he flies into a rage and kills his roommate with an axe. They had argued over who's the true Messiah. George Roden is sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. The way is now clear, and the Branch Davidians have their new leader. To complete his transformation, in 1990, Vernon Wayne Howell legally changes his name for publicity and business purposes to David Koresh.
King David, of course, is one of the most important people in the Old Testament and is a relative of Jesus. So taking the name David Koresh puts him in a position to be seen as a prophetic, a kingly, messianic figure.
This kingly, messianic figure still has bills to pay, not only for himself and his young family, but to help sustain the entire Branch Davidian way of life.
And then David Koresh would recruit people, elderly people with Social Security checks, people that received disability checks, people that would liquidate their assets and give it to the community. And all of that money from all of those people created a cash flow for the group.
In addition to swindling vulnerable people out of their savings, David Koresh creates a new income stream, buying and selling weapons on the black market.
When he becomes more and more interested in guns, and being part of the gun trade can allow him to make money. And he also sees these guns as, again, the idea that the government may come in and try to squelch him, try to bring him down.
On several occasions, they had displayed guns where people would back into their driveway or show some indication that they were going onto their property. Then guns were revealed, people coming out of the buildings out there with guns.
Dealing guns on the black market may not seem like the actions of a holy man, but as he tightens his grip on the Branch Davidians, Koresh is rewriting the rules to suit himself.
And he would say only he understood the book of Revelation, and that if you weren't with him, you would be destroyed in doomsday, in the final judgment.
At some point, he forbids husbands and wives from sleeping in the same bed, like some ancient pagan ruler. He begins to take other men's wives as his own.
He separated the men from the women. Even if they were married, men could not have sex with their wives. And the only people that could have sex in that compound would be David Koresh.
And still his followers find ways to justify this ungodly behavior.
Well, the concept of taking more than one wife wasn't strange to me. It was, from a biblical perspective, you had King David who had 700 wives, Solomon 1,000.
These husbands and wives are consenting adults that condone these actions. But then Koresh begins to prey on girls as young as 10 years old.
And he could be brutal. He could rape children. In fact, he raped Carrie Jewell when she was only 10 years old. And he bragged about it.
How could anyone allow this man to break up their marriage, sleep with their wife, and then violate their underage daughter?
I was unaware of any of these ages or what these girls were. I knew some of them were teenagers, but I didn't know how young they were. I didn't consider it my business to pry into that situation. Whatever he did was according to what God had told him to do.
Even in a closed society like the Branch Davidians, the destruction of social norms isn't something that happens overnight. It's done little by little.
He would have these Bible lessons, these seminars where he would preach for 14 hours.
Gradually, the meetings got longer and longer until eventually they began not in the evening, but they began in the morning. And they lasted from perhaps 10 in the morning until the early hours of the next day. Of course, people were very tired. The evening I was there were about 25 people in the room, and people were falling asleep. I see only one point, and that is to try and confuse somebody, to brainwash them.
Every sin Isaiah says I'm guilty of, I agree. I'm perfect to give you this message.
You know, we were intelligent people who ask intelligent questions. Now remember, all of us came from the background that, you know, this world was going to come to an end very soon, that God was going to do something catastrophic.
Like many cult figures, he says he's getting special revelation from God, and if he would have said right from the get-go, I'm annulling all marriages, people would have been startled by that.
One of the first things you do, it appears in a cult, or a lot of cults, is you give everything. Now that I've given you everything, including maybe my wife, my money, and my daughter, now you completely control me.
But word of the crimes being committed at the Mount Carmel Ranch begins to leak to the outside world.
And it is only when the stories of physical and sexual abuse are joined with information that he's involved in gun running, that's when the federal government becomes very interested in him.
As well as taking other men's wives and sleeping with children, David Koresh has been stockpiling weapons, lots and lots of weapons. He proclaims the Davidians will need them. The end times are coming fast. On a ranch property outside of Waco, Texas, a religious sect preparing for doomsday. The Branch Davidians have always been a bit strange, but now, in the early 90s, they begin acting like they have something to hide, and they do, plenty. For one thing, their leader, David Koresh, is forcing himself on underage girls inside the compound.
One of the things that he feared was that the authorities would do DNA testing and would find out how many of the children were his and who their mothers were and when they gave birth to those children, which would put him in a position of being a child rapist, in addition to whatever other crimes he had committed.
His other crimes include amassing enough guns and ammo to equip a small army. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, are taking notice. David Koresh has an explanation for everything, or so his followers believe.
He believed the seven seals were starting to open and that the end of the world was beginning to take place, and it would be a standoff between the government, which would take place, that instead of it being on the fields of Israel, was going to take place on the fields of Waco, Texas.
They come in here with a gun and they start shooting at us. What would you do?
UPS called us one time on some hand grenade hulls, the kind that you would use set on your desk for paperweights. A box of them they were delivering had damaged the box, and some of them had fallen out. And they called us to go out and look at them. They were not illegal, so we couldn't stop them from delivering them.
David Koresh was the cult leader, and they were being investigated by the ATF for weapons violations and various other violations of federal law.
I was directly involved in the process that led up to the Waco Davidian standoff. I was interviewed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The young man that I deprogrammed was also interviewed by BATF officials, and they used his testimony as part of the affidavit for the warrant for the arrest of David Koresh, which was based on weapons violations. David Koresh was converting semi-automatic weapons to fully automatic.
And yet Koresh's most devoted followers aren't troubled by his stockpiling of weapons and ammunition. A recurring theme of his sermons is that one day the forces of darkness, in the form of the federal government, will come to get them, and they need to be ready.
His explanation is that we were going to be attacked. And he said that God had told him that we were to defend ourselves and get ready for it.
It's war. These governments of this world are coming to an end. Go ahead and laugh. Go ahead and muse in your mind and see what happens to you.
The young man that I deprogrammed, David Koresh, took his credit card without his knowledge and permission and maxed it for $5,000 of bullet. And David Koresh was amassing ammunition, weapons for years.
Reports that they have more than a million rounds.
Based on these reports, on the 28th of February 1993, agents from the ATF move in on the Branch Davidians compound outside of Waco. The ATF's plan for the raid depends on speed, simplicity, and the element of surprise. But it fails on all three accounts. Speed? The ATF agents are transported to the ranch in cattle trucks, visible from miles away. Simplicity? The raid is preceded by 3 military helicopters that are fired upon, way before the cattle trucks even get there. Surprise? The idea of a raid has already been widely discussed in Waco. For days, the news media is on high alert of the presence of a police convoy. At one point, a television news cameraman gets lost, and asks a postman for directions to the Branch Davidians' hangout. The camera guy says they're expecting a big gunfight there. The postman thanks him for the warning and drives back to Mount Carmel. He just happens to be David Jones, the brother-in-law of David Koresh.
So he called David Koresh, and when the ATF agents arrived at the compound, the Branch Davidians, the Army of God, they were locked and loaded.
David Jones is also one of his so-called mighty men. They've been training for an event like this for years. So when the ATF team try to enter the building, they are met with a hail of gunfire from automatic weapons fired by the mighty men.
It just erupted from everywhere. It's like a hailstorm. Pop, pop, pop. It was just all over the place. I got the rifle out, I had a handgun.
To this day, ATF agents insist the shots came from within the compound, while Branch Davidian survivors swear the first shots were fired by the ATF. This is, in many ways, the fulfillment of what David Koresh has been preaching all along. According to his beliefs, the end times are coming, and they will involve a battle with the great Satan, the federal government.
The Branch Davidians did involve target practice, teaching people to use weapons, and again, this is all part of that, the Army of God, that they're going to be called upon.
Not everyone inside that compound is quite so casual about the use of firearms.
For me, it's not the fact that you die, it's how you die. Some people die quickly, some people die slowly. And I just wanted to die quickly.
The ensuing gun battle lasts for nearly an hour and includes hand grenades and helicopters.
Or if you think about an hour of a firefight, that's pretty intense. 4 ATF agents were shot and killed. 20 ATF agents were wounded.
The ATF raid was a fiasco, but the tension will not let up. David Koresh is now in a showdown, not just with the local sheriff, but with the government of the United States. Federal officers have been killed. A tragic process has begun to unfold, and the government agents are facing down a cult-like mentality they cannot understand. In some ways, the Branch Davidians are right where they want to be, inside the fortress of Mount Carmel. They settle in for a long siege, but the raid has also taken its toll on them. 6 Branch Davidians are killed and several wounded. Among the wounded is their leader, Vernon Wayne Howell, aka David Koresh, who's been shot in the hand and stomach.
Want to see one of the holes?
Mother, it's your boy. They shot me and I'm dying, all right?
Convinced that he is dying, David Koresh calls his mother. She's out at the time, so he leaves this message on her answering machine.
Tell Grandma I tried. I'll see y'all in the skies.
But David Koresh does not die that day, and the guns go silent. The ATF has, arguably, given the Sinful Messiah what he has been craving all along, the status of a martyr, and instant notoriety, if not quite fame. The next phase of this deadly tug of war is about to commence.
We were told that there was a situation in Waco, Texas, which I believe was about a 3-hour drive from San Antonio, and that it may go on for a few days and I should pack for 3 or 4 days. I do remember returning home 51 days later with a same bag of clothes meant for 3 or 4 days.
By now, David Koresh must know that if captured, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
I don't think David Koresh ever intended to come out. There was some theory that he was afraid of going to prison. Specifically, he didn't want to go to prison for fear of being sodomized. I remember that coming out as well.
After ruling over the Branch Davidians' compound for years, David Koresh's behavior has finally caught up with him. There are no good options left for this prophet of doom. The only question now is how many of his followers will he take with him?
David Koresh, pick up the phone. Negotiators are attempting to get a hold of you. They would like to speak with you. Pick up the phone.
Waco, Texas, February 1993, the leader of a religious sect and his followers engage in a gunfight with a task force from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. 4 ATF agents have been killed and many more wounded. Half a dozen Branch Davidians lie dead, and their leader has been seriously wounded. But neither Koresh nor his followers are ready to surrender.
The people that were closest to David Koresh, those in authority and those that were just the followers, literally believed that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ. They were willing to give up all of their worldly possessions.
After the gunfight with the ATF, the FBI is called to the scene. Maybe they will have more luck getting Koresh and his followers to come out peacefully. But it's now highly unlikely this is ever going to end well.
With the ATF's really violent beatdown, they turned it over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And from that point on, this began that 51-day siege.
At first, there are encouraging signs the FBI's negotiation tactics might lead somewhere. For several days after the shootout, Koresh does allow a few followers to leave the compound.
On Koresh's side, almost immediately, he started letting some of the people go. And at first we thought that was a good sign, because usually you look at negotiations and normally it starts slow, it builds, and it goes to drip, drip, and then it starts to go there, and then you hope to get a flow.
But after those first few days, the releases slow to a halt. The FBI still try to find common ground with the leader of the Branch Davidians.
So then you have the 51-day standoff, and you have FBI officials repeatedly granting the wishes of David Koresh for food, for a typewriter, for radio broadcasts to be played, tapes that he would send out to be played on national broadcast. I mean, the FBI was very reasonable. But David Koresh over and over again broke his promises to the FBI. He would say, if you do this, I'll come out. If you do that, I'll come out. And then he would not come out. At the end of 51 days, the FBI was exhausted. The FBI thought that he was no longer a reliable person to make any promise because he had broken so many.
The Waco siege ended as an unmitigated disaster. After 51 days, we had reached a total impasse. We had gone for over 27 days with no one coming out. The rhetoric, the tone of the investigations had gotten to where David was getting extremely threatening in his tone.
The decision is made to use tear gas to drive the Davidians from the compound. On April 19th, armored combat engineering vehicles deploy explosives to punch holes in the compound's walls to pump in tear gas. 6 hours after the tear gassing operation begins, there is a shocking development. It's around midday when the Mount Carmel Center bursts into flames at 3 different locations inside the compound. Of the 84 people within, just 9 will escape with their lives. From inside their fighting machines, the FBI agents watch in horror.
We were inside Abrams and also Bradley fighting machines that we were using for cover and for the insertion of the tear gas.
I myself went to the nearest exit, which was out the window. I was shooting everyone else down. They sort of panicked, and I could hear quite a few people running down the corridors on the first floor. I myself came out the first floor window. A lot of entrances had already been blocked by the tanks, knocking down parts of the building.
It seems the FBI is hoping the effects of the tear gas will finally break the will of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. That hope is a fatal miscalculation.
All heard the voice. Now you know. You've got to make a choice. Will you listen to the mystery of life?
The so-called Sinful Messiah and his followers retaliate by setting the Carmel Ranch compound on fire. The flimsy wooden building goes up like a tinderbox.
We later learned that many of the people inside had been shot to death, some had been beaten to death, some had been stabbed to death. More than likely, we thought it was those that were trying to leave.
To leave David Koresh would be to deny their faith. That's how strong their belief were. Some of the people, a lot of the people died. Several of the children were actually, they believed, killed by their parents. Mercy and Kelly, so they kill them either with a knife, a club, a gun, so they don't have to burn in the fire, and then the parents would turn the gun on themselves.
In all, 76 people died, including David Koresh, shot between the eyes by his second-in-command, Steve Schneider. Koresh's wife Shirley and their 3 children, Cyrus, Bobby, and Star, all perish in the fire. They died because of the deeds of their husband and father. To this day, conspiracy theories linger about who really started the fire, despite the heinous acts of Koresh.
A lot of controversy over the origin of the fire. And of course, all the conspiratorialists and anti-government people want us to believe that the FBI started that fire. The FBI did not start the fire.
There is substantial evidence that demonstrates that the fire was caused by those inside the compound. Not just caused by them, but that it was intentionally set. We do have interviews with a number of members who had exited the compound, indicating that there was petroleum-type products that were being spread around the compound. I think the evidence will be overwhelming that that fire was set intentionally by Koresh and some of his core followers.
Rather than burning to death, many Davidians either shoot one another or themselves. David Koresh has already been wounded, but in all probability, it's his trusted lieutenant, Steve Schneider, who finally kills him. The forensic evidence strongly suggests that Schneider, this man who has given Koresh everything, including his own wife, shoots the Sinful Messiah in the head with a rifle before turning the gun on himself. There are survivors of this tragedy and an untold number of others online who still believe that David Koresh truly is the Messiah and that one day he will return.
So they have spun a rationalization which they embrace rather than face the reality that David Koresh was a fraud, which is very difficult for the people that survived because many of them lost loved ones in the fire.
Throughout the catastrophe, devoted follower Graham Craddock hides in a water tower. He's one of just 9 Branch Davidians to survive the carnage. After 13 years in a Louisiana prison for using a firearm during the siege, Craddock was deported back to Australia in 2006. He still waits for Koresh's return.
There's a day in the Bible that calls the great and terrible day of the Lord. We're going to find out then whether David Koresh was who he says he was.
Why did so many people have to die like this? Some of them were so fused together. They were holding each other. There was like 5 or 6 bodies at one point. They realized later that these people were all meshed together. Such a heat and such a closeness. They were afraid. They would not have done this. They wouldn't have allowed themselves to want to kill themselves like that. They didn't want to die. We all wanted to live. I know my children too.
For nearly a century, an isolated, secretive, and abusive community flourishes in the American Southwest.
Unlike anything I think we've seen before, since truly a real theocracy running right in the heart of America.
Its members suffer under strict religious rules.
You are trained only to do as you're told and not think outside the box.
a polygamous society where arranged marriages and sexual abuse of minors is commonplace.
Ruth, how old were you when you got married?
16.
16 years old. How old were you when you became pregnant with your first child?
16.
With unconditional obedience to a leader that they believe to be a prophet.
According to religion, the only one who could really communicate directly with God. So the orders that you were receiving were coming from God.
A cold-blooded leader who rules with true dictatorial power, controlling every aspect of the lives of those who believe in him.
Everything was just getting stricter and stricter and stricter and stricter, and everybody was in trauma mode.
The prophet's name is Warren Steed Jeffs, a man with a depraved and evil mind.
He's a pedophile. He is probably a psychopath. Certainly he has no sympathy or empathy in any meaningful way for all the victims that he has terrorized and done harm to.
Somewhere in the U.S. West, where the Utah and Arizona borders meet, is a town called Colorado City, Arizona. Some of its residents are members of a fundamentalist and polygamous Mormon offshoot group. They had isolated themselves from the mainstream and followed a special leader. But one day some of them managed to escape his powerful grip. It's a quiet evening in the town of Laverton, Utah. Veteran reporter Mike Watkiss reports on a perilous rescue.
My dad sexually molested all of us girls.
I just want to cry. I'm afraid to even make more friends because I feel so dang bad at the sorrow the women go through.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
56.
Everybody's living in fear. I wish I wouldn't have got married when I was 16 because I'm too young to have 3 kids.
These kids are being abused, and the authorities refuse to help them.
Let's go get my kids.
The two best friends, Fawn Hahn and Fawn Broadbent, both just 16 years old, are on the run.
You're a runaway at this point.
I am.
You're a runaway.
Yeah. I don't want what's out there.
And trying to escape a life of servitude within the fundamentalist religious community they grew up in, a few miles away in Colorado City, Arizona.
I don't want to become some 50-year-old man's wife or something like that. We've always been told that people out here are wicked, and I don't believe everyone is wicked.
Now, they look forward to starting a new life with the help of Flora Jessup. Flora's life mission is to help desperate people like them.
When it comes to babies, I'm willing to stand my ground. I'm willing to go to jail. I'm willing to lay my life down to protect children because I know what they go through. I was them.
Also a Colorado City native, Flora Jessup was born and raised in the same polygamist community as these two runaways.
I was born and raised in the FLDS cult. My dad was married to my mother and her younger sister, and between the two of them, they had 28 of us. I got out when I was 16 years old, the first girl that ever got out and lived.
It took courage to leave at 14. They forced that courage on me. It wasn't a choice. A lot of the girls that did leave at my age didn't make it, were, on the streets, prostituted out, stabbed, shot. I got lucky.
Flora Jessup and Penny Peterson have been running an underground network to help women and children escape from the clutches of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their supreme leader, Warren Jeffs. Jeffs is a polygamist with dozens of wives and father to perhaps 100 children. His followers believe he's a living prophet, and God speaks through him. He dictates how they must live their lives, including who they will marry.
What will the Lord do to an immoral people? They shall be destroyed.
Warren Jeffs is not like other cult leaders, charismatic, charming, a good speaker. In fact, he can be deadly dull and boring. What he is instead is the heir to the throne.
Born in Sacramento, California on December 3, 1955, Warren Steed Jeffs is the son of Rulon Jeffs, a high priest apostle from the Circle of Friends, a fundamentalist splinter group of the Mormon Church. The group preserved the Mormon polygamous teachings of its founder, Joseph Smith, after the original movement was abolished early in the 20th century.
You typically need 3 or more wives in order to reach the level in heaven to become a god of in your own right and have your own planet to populate.
Warren's mother was Marilyn Steed, the 4th of as many as 75 wives that Rulon took during his lifetime, some as young as 14. From an early age, Warren strives to catch his father's attention while competing with his many siblings. His ambition leads to cases of abuse and perversion.
But Warren was a nasty cat from when he was very young. He was abusing his sisters sexually way back before his father ever became prophet.
Although it is unknown if Rulon Jeffs abused his wives and children, which may have served as an example to his son, the incestuous abuse of minors is all too common among other polygamist families.
Many of the women spoke about the rampant child abuse that had gone on in their lives, but either by their father or by other relatives. And in many instances, they were told by their mothers to just expect this kind of behavior by men.
Warren Jeffs grows up in Little Cottonwood Canyon, on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, Utah. His father, Rulon, opens the Alta Academy as an alternative school for the children of their fundamentalist group. Rulon appoints his son Warren as the principal.
So this was his first opportunity to really start to wield power, and he would wield it in a very strong and strict way in many ways.
When he was 21, this dorky 21-year-old kid, and suddenly telling all these kids how to live their lives.
Warren Jeffs also starts to reveal some of his sadistic traits.
He had his wife come up and he started to twist her hair until it became obvious in front of the class that it was becoming more and more painful and her face was turning more and more red.
According to their religion, a woman's natural duty is to serve her husband. Her only value is based on how many children she can provide. Women are required to always act sweet and subservient. Brielle Decker, a former student at the Alta Academy, who is destined to become Warren Jeffs' 65th wife, remembers.
I was the 65th wife of Warren Jeffs, and after I escaped almost 8 years ago, so you don't have the right to get angry, you don't have the right to get sad, you don't have the right, and you're bad if you do any of those things. If you're not just like happy with whatever your leader, your priesthood head, your person over you says, then you're not sweet.
They also believe that women can only get to heaven by being invited by their husband, either as a queen or a slave.
I've seen women get in, knock down, drag out, black your eyes, and rip your hair out of your head to see fighting over who gets to deliver his plate of food when he comes home or give him his slippers. I didn't come out of it hating men. I came out of it hating women.
These fundamentalists spread to various communes, where plural marriages often involve teenagers or even close relatives. They are arranged by the priesthood, a council of 7 high priests who dictate the rules to their congregation. Presiding over this council is the leader. Fundamentalists believe he is a living prophet, and his commands come directly from God. Members of the church are taught from the cradle to obey their leader and not have any independent thought outside of their religious beliefs. They must embrace a life of total submission.
We didn't have books or music or games, toys, that kind of stuff. We didn't have that. Typical day was getting up and working in the garden or cleaning or sewing clothes doing laundry. Laundry, always had laundry.
The largest fundamentalist community and its stronghold is found in Colorado City, Arizona. Flora Jessup, born and raised there, suffers a deeply traumatic childhood, unable to rely on those she is supposed to trust the most.
Because I reported the abuse of my father, they walled off the end of a hallway, and I spent 3 years in solitary confinement because I was going against God's commandments, and I was telling secrets that I shouldn't be talking about. I was not allowed to have any association with my mother or my siblings because I would corrupt them.
At the age of 16, Flora Jessup manages to run away from her family. As terrible as it was for Flora, it will turn from bad to worse when Warren Jeffs becomes the leader of the community.
Warren Jeffs was a historic inevitability. A guy like him was going to come along in that community because for so long there were no checks and balances.
From an early age, Warren Jeffs displays his burning ambition for power and control. The son of the high priest of a fundamentalist polygamous Mormon splinter group, he climbs its hierarchy by abusively gaining his father's favor. This secretive community is the perfect breeding ground to support Jeff's lust for perversion and sadism. In 1986, Rulon Jeffs is named the new president of the priesthood and assumes the role of the prophet. Instead of relying on the other high priest to run the church, he makes Warren his trusted main counselor. Warren Jeffs is now just one small step from grabbing the power he craves.
The other 6 members of the priesthood were no longer as important. Some of them had broken off, started their own town, their own sort of branch religion from this. So he had become much more important than some of the earlier prophets.
Under the Jeffs' absolute rule, the congregation renames itself the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, or FLDS. By the late 1990s, Rulon and Warren Jeffs control almost every single aspect of the life of their nearly 10,000 followers, including their assets and their homes. Their possessions belong to the United Effort Plan Communal Trust, an organization that grows to be worth many millions of dollars.
So that meant that individual people really did not own their property, but the trust, the FLDS, owned their property. Again, it's another way of, maintaining control over people.
There's corporations that are basically FLDS controlled that have made, there's one company that has made a fortune in the aerospace, finely precision machinery. They're not stupid business people. They know how to make a buck. They work hard.
Construction proves to be the fundamentalists' most profitable business, not only within their own community, but with large-scale projects. They secure these lucrative contracts by dramatically underbidding their competitors. They gain their competitive advantage by using unpaid laborers, boys as young as 12 years old.
We've had a lot of young boys die working on huge construction projects, running huge equipment.
Another source of income is the skillful abuse of the state and federal welfare systems, which are taxpayer funded. It's a practice that the community calls bleeding the beast.
With this many wives, the first wife was not entitled to food stamps or welfare, but all the second and third and subsequent wives would be, and they would be collecting food stamps and welfare for the numerous children.
They get law enforcement grants, they get city grants, they get highway department grants. As a matter of fact, after 9/11, Colorado City and the FLDS received the 3rd largest Homeland Security grant in the state of Arizona.
They have made a lot of money, and all of that sort of goes into the church kitty run by the prophet.
But perhaps the Jeffs' most valuable asset are the women they control. In a polygamous society, the number of wives is seen as a status symbol for men. It is said he who bestows them has the community in his hands.
The women could only be married to people that were approved by the leadership. That had been done by Rulon Jeffs. That had been the way their community had been run.
Young women have no voice in who they are going to marry, and many become wives and mothers in their teens, long before reaching adulthood.
People go by what the leader is acting like who do they think he's going to partner you up with, instead of teasing you about like, you like so-and-so.
Despite the oppressive control, Rulon Jeffs remains a revered living prophet, protected by his followers, who help keep their community closed to the outside world.
We're not going to have the camera on in here.
Are you a police officer?
No, it's private property.
Are you his private security?
You're not welcome.
At one time, the FLDS controlled Colorado City and Hilldale completely. It was like a fiefdom carved out of two states in which all public funds, the police department, the mayor's office, all government, the schools, everything was controlled by the FLDS.
Meanwhile, Warren Jeffs continues his most obscene and sadistic activities.
He's a pedophile. He was raping children long before anyone knew about it. And he raped his own children, including his own son, who couldn't live with the memory of what his father did to him, and he killed himself.
On August 8, 1998, a stroke renders the aging Rulon incapable of ruling over the FLDS. Warren Jeffs steps in as the acting president of the church.
I only remember Warren Jeffs basically being in charge. I mean, he tried to say his father was in charge. He tried to use his father's words, but his father was handicapped, kind of.
Warren Jeffs is now perfectly positioned to take over the full leadership of the FLDS. He redefines much of the church literature and restructures the school's curriculum. He institutes the new edict supposedly on behalf of his father. In 1986, Rulon Jeffs is nominated to be president of the priesthood of the Fundamentalist Circle of Friends, assuming the power of the prophet. Lurking in his shadow is his son, Warren Steed Jeffs. After Rulon suffers a stroke, Warren restructures the leadership of the FLDS to solidify himself as a sole authoritarian ruler.
The FLDS was not a good community. It was extremely authoritarian, very controlling, very harsh on women, very harsh on children. It depended in large part on child labor. Through the United Effort Plan, the UEP controlled all the property, all the housing. There was nothing that the Jeffs family did not control.
Then in 2002, Rulon Jeffs passes away.
I'll never forget the day. We went up to Colorado City. It was cold and overcast, and it was the funeral for Rulon Jeffs, the ruler, the guy, the prophet, Warren's father, who had been the leader for 18, 20 years. And there's about 6,000 people showed up in that little town. They buried him.
It's a loss, but it's will be continued on. The watchword is to carry on. Everyone seems very much at peace.
Within weeks, Warren Jeffs officially assumes the power of the prophet and the presidency. A new era of the church begins.
Rulon Jeffs arguably was a much more reasonable ruler than his son Warren. And Warren Jeffs became the end of the FLDS as it was known because he was so disruptive.
So bad became good and good became bad. And it was so fast. Like, he did it within a few years. He had reversed so many things at a consistent rate.
Protected by security, inside a walled compound, he lives with his numerous wives. The count skyrockets after he marries many of his own father's widows. Jeffs quickly issues edicts aimed to further restrict freedom of movement and thought, always using the argument that God commands these decisions.
We live in such a wicked day. The people on this land of America are an adulterous generation. We do not want to be like them. The prophets have declared, I would rather have my son or daughter in the grave than commit sins of immorality.
They didn't have any education. because Warren Jeffs had banned the internet, he banned television, he banned movies, he got rid of all the dogs. There were no pets to be seen. Everybody, it was very quiet. You might see these giant oversized trampolines, but sports were banished too, basketball.
He even finds ways to profit financially while increasing his mind control over the community.
Warren pulled all of the FLDS kids out of public school and insisted on homeschooling. So suddenly you had these schools that used to have hundreds of kids. Now they got a handful of kids who are not FLDS, still being run by the FLDS community, and they bankrupted the school.
Well, I think the invitation from the church to strengthen the home schools and the private schools had a very significant impact.
It's a cult. All those children up there are out of public schools and they're not being educated. I wish the children to be educated. I wish them to leave the girls alone and the boys alone till they're 18 years old before they pick on them for marriage.
Meanwhile, tax money pours into a virtually empty school, eventually ending up in the pocket of Warren Jeffs. Jeffs uses this money to expand his loyal entourage and also indulge in activities that run counter to his own preaching.
He was out traveling around and partying. He was going to New Orleans, to Mardi Gras, and going to strip clubs and all kinds of things like that because God wanted him to witness the wicked world.
And like all dictators, there comes a time when Warren Jeffs feels the need to assert his power and excommunicate anyone whom he believes may threaten his authority.
They're excommunicated from the church. They have to walk away from the homes they built. They have to leave the wives, multiple wives, and usually dozens of children.
Warren Jeffs wields the power because all the homes, businesses, and other assets of the followers belongs to the United Effort Plan, and the UEP is controlled by him. Women and children are also considered church property. One of these followers, Ross Chatwin, resists Jeff's commands and refuses to leave the town and his family.
My family and I do not plan on leaving our home anytime soon. I am pleased to report that my wife has committed to stay by my side regardless of Jeff's commandments to leave me.
But for others, this would mean the beginning of the end of their families, as well as isolation from the community.
One man named Richard Holm, he'd given millions of dollars to the FLDS. He's a very successful businessman. Warren came to him and said, essentially, you're a sinner and you need to repent for your sins. Go away and write down your sins, and then you send me what they are, and I'll consider letting you back in. While he's doing that, Warren is taking his multiple wives and children and giving them to other men, assigning them to other men.
Over time, the number of available adult single women decreases. This leads to more instances of child brides, as well as a dramatic rise in teenage pregnancies. Women start to be seen as a valuable commodity, as the unbalance between the number of girls and boys leads to fierce competition between the younger males.
And only the most loyal boys, the ones that are shown that they can be more loyal to the prophet than to their own families, those are the only ones that are allowed to stay.
Hundreds of boys age 13 and above have fled or been expelled from this society and at the demand of its fanatical prophet leader, Warren Jeffs.
To avoid future competition for wives, and also a potential threat to his authority, Warren Jeffs has to suppress the male population. He expels many of the community's young men, after using them as slaves for a good part of their youth. When they reach their teens, he declares them as degenerate for reasons like watching a film or listening to music. Families must choose between the prophet and their own blood. Many of the FLDS members, and especially the women, feel like hostages trapped in the powerful grip of Warren Jeffs.
There were all kinds of mechanisms to keep women in line. If they started to raise hell, they could put them in mental institutions, and they had a cozy relationship with a couple of mental institutions, so they could put women who caused trouble into one of these mental institutions, then have them diagnosed as crazy, so if they ever went back, they could never get their kids.
The local authorities are not an option these victims can call upon.
What I got from them is that they're trying to communicate to me that I don't have the right to go in there and make a complaint about the fact that my daughter could be being raped right now by a 39-year-old man.
Members of the FLDS also work within local law enforcement. Being polygamous themselves, they have been instrumental in keeping the local community practices away from the state authorities.
Is there a pattern of girls being married in this town? 15, 16-year-old girls being married to older men? I understand many of the law officers have young wives.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that. It's personal business, and you talk about your personal business.
I'm not married to teenage girls.
Neither am I.
Okay, are any of your officers?
No, they are not.
None of them. None of the law officers in this town are married.
Actually, I'll make no comment on that, okay? It's none of your business.
They sent men out to become law enforcement certified. The problem with that is these people don't adhere to the law of the land. They adhere to God's law, which is the rules of the prophet.
My understanding is that you are a sworn police officer in both the state of Utah and the state of Arizona, and that you have teenage brides and perhaps impregnated this young woman when it would be a statutory rape.
We don't have anything to say except to the court.
With complete control over the FLDS and its community, Warren Jeffs rules like an authoritarian dictator, protecting his most loyal followers and terrorizing those who fall from the ranks of his privileged elite.
I think he likes pain, like seeing people go through pain. He likes to take away their hope really slowly, so he had tactics like he would find out what you really wanted and just like take it away from you in little tiny pieces. It was torture.
And whatever sort of psychological diagnosis, he's just a mean bully who found a convenient way to get power. Not because he's a charismatic, good-looking, great orator, because he's a conniving little who went on the coattails of his father, seized power, and realized, I can get away with whatever I want.
How long will Warren Jeffs be able to maintain his authoritarian rule in public and his sadistic perversity in private? How long will his victims tolerate his brutality? After years of operating in his father's shadow, upon the death of his father Rulon, Warren Jeffs seizes control of the FLDS. This begins a new age of absolute dictatorship over the fundamentalist community. Stricter and more extreme rules limit the freedom of movement, thought, and choice. Those who Warren Jeffs perceives as a threat to his authority are expelled from the church. They are forced to leave behind their families and the homes they built. People in the twin towns of Colorado City and Hilldale live under the rule of an undisputed leader and his loyal followers.
He has absolute control over these people. He really does.
This is a new leader, and if he was to ask for violence, there's undoubtedly that's what he would get.
But an underground rebellion begins to take shape among former members of the FLDS.
You had a number of women who had escaped and gotten out. Flora Jessup, Penny Peterson, a couple of women, names that I should be enshrined in history. Women who had gotten out, and they were not going to take it anymore. I started this knowing that there were the abuses going on, but nobody was really telling the deep story.
I was 14 years old. They come and told me I was going to marry a man, 48 years old. I was going to be his fifth wife. I didn't want to do it. I ran as fast and as hard as I can go.
Some of the women who escaped organized an underground railroad to support other women and young boys desperate to flee the church.
And then came back and started fighting for my siblings when my 14-year-old baby sister was forced to marry her stepbrother and raped so brutally on her wedding night that she nearly died from the hemorrhaging. And that began my fight to take them down. Somebody had to be the one who stood up on the front lines and took the hits. And I accepted the choice, knowing that I was not going to be able to have a relationship with my mom and my brothers and sisters.
I say the crimes that are committed here, that the state
law enforcement should address are such things as statutory rape.
Does that happen here?
Oh, definitely. These plural wives, none of them are legally married. They're all...
And are some of them younger than 16?
Yes, some of them are.
And they marry first cousins?
Oh, definitely a lot closer. They have aunts marrying nephews and uncles marrying nieces. They're that close. That's quite prevalent.
Yet the prosecutors encounter a persistent problem.
Court date would be set, women wouldn't show up. They were too afraid to testify, to come into court and testify. They knew if they did, Warren would tear apart their families or do something to them.
But accessory to rape isn't the only possible charge against Jeffs in his community. Like many other congregations, the FLDS has a long history of fraudulently receiving government benefits.
But very often it is because people who create cults also like not paying taxes. And if you create a 501c3 religious nonprofit, no property tax, no taxes on contributions, less accountability.
As authorities seek to charge Jeffs with crimes ranging from conspiracy to commit sexual misconduct with a minor to tax and welfare fraud, he decides to flee the area. He establishes a new secret commune in the town of El Dorado, Texas. This new ranch, where some of the most prominent FLDS families move, is named Yearning for Zion. After the dedication of the ranch's new temple on January 1st, 2005, Warren Jeffs goes on the run again.
There were people scattered all throughout the West that were in cahoots with Warren Jeffs to keep him underground and not found. They traveled a lot at night, for one thing. I mean, he would have a car in Colorado, for example, and then they would drop off the car, maybe in Utah, they would pick up another car.
While on the move, Warren Jeffs shows up at member gatherings to lead services and conduct marriages. Some involve child brides in secluded chapels. He moves some of his wives to various states. At the same time, he takes new brides. Brielle Decker will become his 65th wife.
Well, I don't remember registering that he was on the run until after the ceremony. I remember when he was talking to my father, when he was sending me back to his house. She can't do all this stuff because I'm running for the law. I wasn't able to wear my wedding dress. Like I didn't even have time to get it. My mother was not invited. My wedding was not anybody there except for who Warren Jeffs wanted there, which was he had to have 3 witnesses, so he called in like 2 of his brothers and my father was a witness.
Fearing they will be questioned by state authorities, Jeffs also relocates his children. By this time, the states of Utah and Arizona are offering $10,000 rewards for the capture of Warren Jeffs. Once the FBI gets involved, the reward balloons to $100,000. Jeffs is placed on their most wanted list.
So now everybody's looking for Warren. It just so happens that a state trooper in Nevada just outside of Vegas sees this flashy burgundy Escalade racing down the freeway and he can't really see the plates very well, so he pulls it over. And state trooper Eddie Dutchover made himself quite an arrest that night.
Inside the car, Dutchover finds Warren Jeffs, his brother Isaac, and one of his wives, Naomi. A search of the vehicle uncovers computers, mobile phones, a GPS tracker, an assortment of disguises, including several wigs and sunglasses, and a stash of more than $50,000 in cash. When these items are pulled out of the car, Jeffs displays no reaction.
You know, he just stood along the side of the road and he was very quiet. And I think he was startled. I think he was absolutely stunned that, you know, that he'd finally been caught.
On August 28, 2006, after nearly 21 months on the run, the chase for one of America's most wanted criminals finally ends.
Warren Jeffs had been brought up in this very enclosed society, so and somewhat privileged, and could do whatever he wanted without any kind of ramification. And now, for the first time in his life, he was finally going to be in a situation that he did not control.
In the early 2000s, a group of FLDS escapees create a secret network to help women and children flee the polygamist Mormon group. Aided by reporter Mike Watkiss, authorities launch an investigation into the church and its leader, Warren Jeffs. After being on the run as one of the FBI's most wanted, Jeffs is finally arrested on the outskirts of Las Vegas.
By early 2007, which is about 4 or 5 months following his arrest, he's throwing himself against the walls, essentially trying to end his life because he's in such misery. He's fasting. At one point they have to take him out of there and take him to a hospital and try and, build him back up.
Warren Jeffs also makes a shocking confession to one of his followers.
He tells him, I'm not the prophet. I'm a wicked man. I was never the prophet. And he goes into this whole confession, basically renouncing everything that he has apparently stood for up until this time.
Jeffs claims that before dying, his father Rulon told him that after his death, William E. Jessup should take leadership of the FLDS. Instead of following his father's orders, Warren Jeffs usurps the power of the president and the prophet. Jeffs' problems have only just begun. In 2007, Elisa Wall, a former member who at age 14 had been forced into a marriage with her own cousin, becomes the first woman willing to come forward and press charges against Jeffs.
This trial has not been about religion or a vendetta. It is simply about child abuse and preventing further abuse.
The court finds Warren Jeffs guilty of being an accomplice to rape. He is sentenced to 10 years in prison. But this is not the only charge leveled by authorities against Warren Jeffs. On April 3, 2008, a woman identifying herself as Sarah makes a phone call to a domestic abuse hotline, claiming to be a 16-year-old minor who is being abused by a 50-year-old man. The crime is taking place inside the Yearning for Zion ranch. The ranch was the new FLDS secret compound that Warren Jeffs dedicated in El Dorado, Texas, where part of the FLDS relocated and kept living according to their religion, despite their prophet being in prison.
And when the authorities became aware of that, they raided that compound and they took out 400 children.
The children are taken into custody by the Texas Child Protection Services and placed in foster care for several weeks.
For the first couple of weeks that they had those children, they said that they were very quiet when they first got there. And then after about 2 weeks, they started playing and, laughing a little bit and just started to act a little bit like kids.
But when the concerned biological parents demand that their children keep taking vitamins supplied by the FLDS, the foster care families notice something odd.
And as soon as they started taking these vitamins, the family said these kids turned into zombies. Sat silently, didn't move, didn't participate, just sat there. We don't know what they were providing them with. There was no questions asked.
Some foster families also suspect that many of these children are victims of sexual abuse.
In the family that had the 9 children, 4 of those children, those little boys, had been sodomized so badly that they had no bowel control. This is the type of abuse that is very typical in this community.
In the end, authorities find out that the phone call was made by Rosita Swinton, a woman who had a history of mental problems and making similar types of calls. Without a real witness, the case ends up being dropped.
In ruling this way, the Third Court of Appeals has stood up for the legal rights of these families and given the mothers hope that their families will be brought back together very soon.
That gave all of those children back. And those caseworkers have told me that they physically had to push children across the room while they begged them not to make them go back.
Ironically, there's an upside to this hoax call. During the raid, authorities discover a troubling case involving one of these children, 14-year-old Mary Ann Jessup.
Based upon the raid that was conducted at the ranch and the documents that were produced and the photographs that came out of that, she was married to Warren Steve Jeffs at that age. Again, obviously against the law.
Besides the documentation, authorities also find shocking audio recordings filled with bizarre details.
That temple had an interesting little feature, a big long bed. Warren's a big tall man, and, you know, I mean, basically he built himself a little rape bed right there in the temple, you know, all white, and supposedly ordained of God.
He would take these little girls as his wives and have his adult wives hold them down while he raped them and recorded it.
When the state of Texas brings Warren Jeffs and some of his closest followers to trial in 2011, these recordings serve as hard evidence.
But during the course of that trial, they played for the jurors an audio tape that Warren had recorded. Well, he was in essence raping 12-year-old girl, and you hear this guy's creepy voice sort of grooming this child, and her this meek little voice of this little girl as Jeffs was raping her.
With clear proof of his guilt, the judge and jury are merciless with Warren Jeffs. On August 9th, 2011, he's sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. The state of Utah takes over the church-controlled United Effort Plan Trust, returning all its assets and property to current and former members of the FLDS. One of them is Brielle Decker, who left the church and started a new life.
I applied for Warren Jeffs' house and was granted it. And I had to find a buyer, and so it's 45 rooms. I found a buyer, and it is a worldwide organization called the Dream Center.
Warren Jeffs' former house, once a symbol of his authority, is transformed into the Short Creek Dream Center. It becomes a place to support the local community, including women and children who left the FLDS.
I do work there as an advisory board member. Difference between how dark it was to now how much hope there is, how much freedom I have to choose and sort out what I want and all these options. It's very empowering.
So how has life changed in Colorado City and Hilldale over the last several years?
There's been a real breath of change. They've got a wonderful new high school up there that I understand is doing very well. So the community, I think, is doing pretty good, but you know, the faithful, there's still pockets of them up there. There will always be adherents to the religion, and they've scattered off into new little compounds in South Dakota.
Despite being in prison, Warren Jeffs still runs the FLDS from his cell in Texas. In 2011, he reasserted his position as prophet.
So who's leading it now, the group?
Warren Jeffs is.
I mean, his family, you know, his wives and his kids and his brothers, they all still suck up to him and they go in to see him regularly, and he doesn't seem to have any problem getting messages out to his community. I think he's still running the shots for the most part.
Warren Jeffs is the prophet of God. He was in the beginning, from the time he was ordained to that office, and he is now.
Recorded sermons and written edicts keep reaching the community. These include his arranging marriages that his followers obey like they always did.
This is our religion. We love our religion.
It is the people who follow him that have enabled him to become who he is. The parents need to be held accountable for the crimes that have been committed against their children, because they are the first line of defense that a child has. And every one of the mothers up there have failed that, including my own.
Warren Jeffs has left a dark, traumatic legacy, and the consequences of his evil somehow seem to never end.
There are so many people who have suffered under this man's authority for so many years, and many suicides, many people that have really suffered, especially the children.
The pain is knowing that there's still a lot of suffering in that community, and the young women are still being abused, and little boys are being exploited as slave labor and then kicked out of their families. And, you know, to know that you want to put a stop to these kind of things, and as much as things have changed, I know that a lot of that's still going on.